welcome to episode 10 of the Happy Teacher Pod. Today we are going to be talking about
interviews.
Yeah.
So how do happy teachers, such as ourselves,
Yeah.
make sure we have a happy interview?
Yeah, so in episode 7 we spoke about the application process, but we did think it was important to also speak about the interview process, as we have both been through many different interviews for many different roles, and it can be really, really nerve-wracking. No, it often is very nerve-wracking because obviously you're trying to sell yourself.
I think it's incredibly nerve-wracking because not only are you having an interview, whatever role you're going for in teaching, you're always being observed, watching, like doing a lesson.
Yeah, that's definitely always part of the interview process, whether it's a very short watching of a lesson, which we spoke about in episode 7, or whether it's a whole hour, which I've had many times before. That is always part of the process. And actually, if you're going for head of year roles or assistant head roles, they can actually ask you to do other things. So I don't know if you've ever been asked to like do an assembly before, for example, or like something like that, which is obviously even more nerve-wracking.
What I had as my head of year process, but that I had to.
I thought you done an assembly, didn't you?
No, I didn't have to do an assembly. I had to do it where someone we both know, a colleague, pretended to be an angry parent.
Oh yes, I had to do that for my head of year role as well.
I had to placate the angry parent.
Yeah. I had to do that too, role playing.
Mm.
That is a hard one at interview, actually.
Yeah.
I'm not going to lie, I don't like the role play situation. But yeah, so for the break time banter today, I wanted to do one about one of the interviews that I've been on. So for my very first interview, when I was an NQT, it was a bit of a weird one. So basically, I done my PGCE. So for a PGCE, you're at university for part of the time, and then you go into schools for 2 different placements. And I was on my second placement, and everyone was, in that application. It was around February time, so it's like everyone had started applying for their roles that they wanted to go into schools. And I'd gone on one interview. I didn't get it. They gave it to someone more qualified than me, because obviously I was only going in as what they called an ECT now, but it was an NQT at the time. And I was like, yeah, fair enough. And actually, blessing in disguise, I didn't get that one, to be fair, because it was really far away. But I was young and naive and thought to myself, just got to get a teaching job. And I was in that kind of arena. But basically, I got contacted on Facebook by... This shows how old I am, by the way, because Facebook was pretty much the only social media at the time, by the head of department at this school. And he was like, oh, hi, are you Roxy? And I'm like, yeah. I'm like, who is this person? And they were like, oh, I got your number, I think it was, which then would have connected him to my Facebook or whatever, from your, the tutor that I had at the time on my PGCE. And I was like, okay. So essentially I was like headhunted for that one. So he was like, oh, I just wondered, would you be interested in coming in for an interview? I asked, I can't remember what her name was, my tutor at the time, who she would think would be a good person to work in this school. It was a bit of a rough school that I was going into. So, and she said that, you would be really good for this role. So, do you want to come in? It was for an RE teacher. And I was like, okay. I was like, yeah, sure. Never been approached on Facebook before, but I was like, fine, whatever. Went in, and I remember the lesson, and I remember I done debate boxing in the lesson, which was really random, but I just remember doing that. I can't remember what the lesson was about. It was an RE lesson, but he'd given me a class that was 15 boys and 1 girl, and I remember that really clearly, because I remember thinking, oh, that's like a really odd ratio. And before the lesson, he'd sent me, which usually is the case, he'd sent me just a little rundown of the class, this is how many students are in the class, here are the SEN needs, and and actually that school, the whole cohort done RE, and so it was setted, and this was bottom set. So it was bottom set, 15 boys, 1 girl, and it was hard. It was really, really hard. But I'd done the interview, I got offered the job basically on the spot. He basically said to me, oh, should we walk to the head teacher's office so she can offer you the job? And I was like, yeah, like me as an NQT, I was thinking, yeah, brilliant. Of course I'm going to take the role and take whatever I can get. And this was quite early on in the whole kind of application process. So when you're teaching, you want that, if you can get a job in March time, that's like perfect. That means you've got like quite a long amount of time to kind of, whatever. And he was like, we'd like you to start in the summer. Brilliant. I got paid over the summer holidays. I had to start like 2 weeks before the summer. I was like, of course I will start before the summer. Because I was very skint at the time, obviously having to pay for university and not getting paid, essentially. I know you obviously went down a different route so that you could get paid while training. Anyway, so this, after the fact, like after I got the job and obviously he ended up...
So you did go to that school, that was
your first that was my first school, worked there for 2 years, met my husband there, everything, so like, it played its role in my life for sure. It was an extremely rough school, the behaviour was like mad, it was a baptism of fire. For sure, but after the fact, after I'd got the job and I was like there, and he ended up being my line manager, the guy that interviewed me, and he said to me, like he admitted, maybe it was about a year later, he was like, "Oh, I gave you that class on purpose because," he said to me, "I thought if she can handle that class, she basically can handle working here," because it was a really tough school to work in. And I was like, right, thanks for that. Like, I'm brilliant. Like, I've come for this interview. Thank God I was bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and just fresh into the profession. And I didn't, I kind of saw it as a challenge and I was like, oh, this is fine. Now, on the other hand, if they'd done that to me, I don't know if I would take so kindly to that, giving me the worst class, basically. It was a year 11 class as well, so it was like really, GCSE cohort. Anyway, I ended up, in that school, having 6 GCSE classes as a NQT. Because it was setted and it was whole cohort, I had 3 year 10 classes, 3 year 11 classes. Gosh. And I remember I had like 15 classes total because all my other classes were Key Stage 3. Yeah, it was a bit of a mad, I guess maybe it taught me that, I can handle a lot more than, and also, but the thing is I was childless and also just was fresh into it.
Yeah, you don't know any different. Yeah. So I obviously came into teaching a different way. I did it through Teach First, and they placed you in a school. So you had no idea what you're going to. And mine exactly that, baptism of fire. It was a difficult school, but I had nothing to compare it to really, except for my other Teach Firsters who would tell me about their schools.
Right.
And I knew mine was somewhere in the middle because other people just seemed like they could get through their lesson material every lesson. I was like, oh God, I can't do that. Whereas I had at the other extreme someone that was only allowed to photocopy 30 sheets of paper a month.
A month?
30 sheets of paper.
Oh my God, how did they survive doing that?
And I remember he used to pick a class per month that got his paper. And then I remember he told me that in one of these classes, a very naughty boy in the class bullied everyone into giving him the paper. And then he started a fire.
Okay, so interview-wise though, because we've been to so many interviews, we've basically come up with a little tick list of things that you're probably going to get happen at an interview and how you should approach these things. So Jenny, do you want to start off with the first one?
Yeah, so I guess one of the first things I thought of is just know that in every single interview they will ask you a safeguarding question. So whatever role you're doing, teacher, assistant head, they want to know that you know how to handle a safeguarding scenario. So just think about lots of different scenarios they could ask you, and essentially the answer is always tell the designated safeguarding lead.
Yeah.
And
so I've always, in the assistant head interviews that I've had, they always do it as part of the prioritisation. So they will always have an interview question usually as well on safeguarding, but that one's really, really easy to spot because they'll usually ask you something quite direct about safeguarding, like how would you report or what would you do in this situation. But the prioritisation tasks are really interesting because usually they'll give you a list of around 15 things and they'll be like, oh, these things are happening in your day, how would you prioritise them? So that's part of the task first of all, because they want to see how you prioritize things. And then the second thing is usually what I've had is explain what you would do with this specific thing. So some of the things you can delegate, obviously. Some of the things that you would have to do yourself. Some of the things would involve asking your line manager or kind of seeking further advice. But they always put a safeguarding one in there, because obviously every teacher is responsible for safeguarding. So what they want to see is that you can pick up the safeguarding one. So I remember on one interview I got like a upskirting things. It was like an upskirting incident has been reported to you. What, like, you know, where would you put that in? That obviously that was the safeguarding thing. So I'm like, right, that goes right to the top.
Yeah.
And like you said, tell your designated safeguarding lead. But potentially, and you know, we'll teach the responsible for safeguarding. So what I always caveat that with is, if you can't find the designated safeguarding lead, and you know, then you may have to also deal with part of that safeguard yourself. Now, obviously, I'm in pastoral, so I have to deal with safeguarding all the time. But actually, I've fallen foul of the trap in interviews before of kind of thinking that I know I'm going to always spot it, because I deal with safeguarding all the time. So I think you're right. Be aware. It's going to be in there.
Yeah, if it hasn't come yet,
it's going to be in there. Yeah, it's coming. They're going to definitely ask you a safeguarding question, or they're going to put it in a task, or they're going to do something around that. I've been asked to write a letter before as well as part of the task. So I think that goes nicely onto the next thing, actually, which I can talk about, is that they will always give you some kind of task to do. Now, dependent on the role will depend on what tasks they give you. And they can give you multiple different tasks. Like, for head of year roles, I've had write a letter to a parent that has made a complaint, or a trip letter. I've had like write a trip letter about, you know, this trip that you're running or whatever. Data analysis. So like, here's some data on your year group, and I've had that for assistant head role as well. Like, here's some data on this area. How do you read the data? Like, what can you spot from here? Can you think of any problems, solutions? So like, thinking about, because data is so subjective, you know, they want to see what are you picking out. And they're not necessarily asking you to solve loads of issues when they're asking you for the data analysis. They're just saying, how are you analysing this data? Like,
can you recognise some trends? A bit kind of linked to the prioritising again. Can you see the most concerning bits? Or...
Yes, that bit as well. Like, are you spotting the most concerning? And I like the word trends, actually. Are you looking at the trends? You know, if you're going for a pastoral role, are you looking at the trends for attendance, for example, or for behaviour stats or whatever else? Or if you're going for like a teaching and learning role, which I'd been for before, they asked, it was a data task on achievement in, you know, certain subjects. And they just wanted you to look at the trends to say, like, again, not to give solutions, but to look at what are you spotting in there. Other tasks I've had, fishbowl tasks. I don't know if you've ever done a fishbowl task, fishbowl activity before. That is to see what type of leader you are. So usually within assistant head roles, interviews, they will do that. That's where you're basically sat round the table in a fishbowl.
With the other candidates.
Yeah, with the other candidates. And then you are being observed
right
by usually the head teacher plus some other members of SLT. And I think that is also to see whether you'll fit in with their team.
Yeah. And what sort of team player you are.
Are you the person that's like taking charge of this fishbowl activity, which I've read is not, you're not supposed to do that. Like, are you kind of over talking everybody?
Teacher,
or exactly. Or are you someone that sits back too much? Are you just putting in random, like, kind of tidbits that actually make no difference to the conversation? Like, are you just talking to talk? And so that's definitely, I've had a lot of fishbowl. I don't really like the fishbowl activities because you actually never know what they're looking for. And so for me, it's like that unknown of, you want to be yourself, you want to show, you know, what you're like as a person, but at the same time you're like, oh, you overanalyze everything as you're doing it.
Yeah, but you know what, that kind of links into what we were going to talk about you asking questions of them and it being a two-way process. You don't know what they're looking for, so all you can do is be yourself. And then if they don't pick you, you're not what they're looking for, but maybe they're not what you're looking for either.
It's always good to keep that in mind through the
maybe
interview
there's someone,
process.
if it was an assistant head role, maybe they've already got someone, you know, almost exactly like you, and they're looking for something completely different, so it just wasn't meant to be.
Yeah.
So that's actually probably quite, I know what you mean, it's kind of, it's a bit frightening to be in a situation where you think, I don't really know what they want from me, but all you can do is be the best version of you, and if that's not what they want, then you probably don't want them either.
Yeah, so I think, like, obviously when you're going into that school environment, hopefully you would have done a visit beforehand, which is what we spoke about, and you would have kind of got a vibe of the school, whether you like the school or not. And then, it is really about sussing out whether this is a school that you would actually like to work in. What I do love is that they usually do a little student tour, don't they, when you go for an interview? And so, like, I love speaking to the students,
it's really
because
revealing.
usually you can get the most information out of the students rather than the head teacher's not really going to tell you any things that might,
they're not going to tell you
red flags or like alarm bells might start ringing, you know. And so and actually that probably leads on nicely to the next thing. I have had a student panel on probably every single interview that I've been to, and so usually there's a student panel. I've actually had a staff panel before as well.
But you know what, this is all so different. So everything you're saying here, I'm thinking I can't relate to at all, because I was just thinking about all the different private schools I've worked at. I've never had anything but interviews.
Huh,
so I think once you talk about your panel, I can talk a bit more about private schools, because I've not had to do any task you've just described there, I've not had to do any of them.
Yeah, so I've had to do all of them. They do make you jump through a lot of hoops at interview. Now, obviously, the final thing is that you will always have an interview, like you were saying, that you will have an interview.
And one interview.
Yeah.
See, everywhere I've worked at, when it's private school,
well, actually, no, it depends. I've had 2 interviews before.
So I always have 2 interviews.
Yeah.
And that's all I have.
So 2 interviews by the same people?
No. So they do it that you always have an interview with the head teacher and another member of SLT, and then you have a separate interview with the deputy head and another member of your department if you're going
okay, you know, that's very similar to my most recent interview. It was a staff panel, which was essentially the the assistant head who is my line manager now, the Senko, who's another assistant head essentially, and then another member of staff. So it was basically 3 members of staff. Now they weren't at the final interview or whatever they call it at a private school, where it was the head teacher. And my school, it was the 2 deputy heads, so it was the head teacher and the 2 deputy heads. And for that one, I had to do a presentation as well. So like I said, sometimes, and this is what I mean, it differs for every job role that I've been to. Sometimes presentation, sometimes 2 interviews, like I had at this school, and at our old school, I also had 2 interviews.
Yeah.
Whereas other schools, I've only ever had 1 interview, which is basically with the head teacher and the deputy head or another.
So when
SLT
you've had
member.
2 interviews, what was the difference between the 2 interviews? Like, did they have a different focus each time?
Yeah, they were asked different questions. Yeah, they were definitely asked different questions.
And in what sort of sense? So, like, was one of them more pastoral and one was more about your subject knowledge, or?
No, and actually in both of the interviews, they both asked a safeguarding question. I remember for the head of year one, I was asked about like parental engagement. I was asked about what I would do in terms of extracurricular, like what I would do if I was there and I had an attendance issue, or I had a parent call up and make a complaint, and all of those types of things. So I think, like, leading on to that final interview, did they ever give you scenarios on your interviews?
So ours, this is what I was trying to get at, to see if your interviews had themes, because ours are very much, you have your more traditional interview that I would have had at state schools, where it's you're going to get a safeguarding scenario, tell me about a time when a lesson went badly, all that sort of stuff that you kind of expect to see if you're a good teacher.
Right.
But then you have an academic interview where it's seeing how well you can talk about your subject. So I went to my first.
That.
Yeah, so my
I would actually love that.
Yeah,
it was thrive really in an interview like that.
But it's quite different. So you go in knowing, okay, I'm now meeting with the deputy head academic.
Okay.
And the head of history or whatever that person is that's a specialist in your subject. So I remember going for interviews where it was the head of department plus the deputy head happened to also be a historian. So I'd get asked things like, okay,
what's
you're
your
allowed
favourite
to
part
have
in history or something?
or things like, Yeah, so they would say they'd have a starter question like, tell us about a topic in history that you're really interested in.
Okay.
But then they would probably know about that topic in history, and then they'd ask you in a lot more detail. They'd ask you about which historians, which line of thought you go with.
Yeah.
I remember getting asked questions about kind of a historical dinner party who I'd invite along, and why.
That's such a classic history question
Yeah.
to ask you.
Yeah.
Okay, I like that though.
So I just think if you are applying for private schools, I think I'm just thinking across the 3 that I've applied for, there always tends to be an academic interview where they want to see that you actually love your subject, you think about your subject, you're still passionate about
your subject.
things that you did at university, but also that you're still reading history books now, and that you show that you've got that passion. Whereas the other interview would be very much more seeing that you're a good teacher. So I felt like it was always seeing, am I a good historian? Am I a good teacher?
Yeah.
Then you get the student tour, and then that's everything normally, even if it's a teacher role or a head of department role.
I wonder why that is. I wonder why at state schools they're making you jump through so many hoops, but at a private school they're really not. Like it's still essentially the same process. They're still interviewing you, but I feel like at a state school, and like my husband's been for quite a few roles as well, like assistant head roles. Oh my god, like some of them are like jam packed full, like 2 days of stuff, and you've been through the mill by the end of it. You're like, oh my god, if I don't get this job, I've literally really just gone for this for like 2 whole days. And you can feel a little bit resentful about it when it's such a long process.
Yeah, because when you're talking about all these activities, I was thinking, so I applied for a private school to be a head of department, and they just, through the questions they asked me, gained information as to whether they think I'd be a good head of department. So they would say things like, how would you ensure that you had a high uptake of students doing GCSE history,
right.
or what would your provision be outside the classroom to encourage a love of history. And then I guess, I don't know, I'm looking back now, I guess looking through what I would say in my application, they could see my evidence of knowing how to get good results, because I'd be talking about my grades. But there isn't something that like directly mirrors some of those tasks that you're saying. They're just kind of asking me questions about being a leader and how I would do things.
Okay, and I will definitely post on socials about those specific things that I've done, because a lot of people will more often than not be going for state school interviews, and that is what they do at state school interviews. I mean, for me, the interview is kind of, it's one of the most nerve-wracking bits, because obviously you're just directly speaking to them and you have to think on the spot. But I would say the major kind of point for that one is have some examples to hand, and we were speaking about this before, that you need to have examples. And actually really what you should have done is look through your application and think, what are those 4 or 5 things that you spoke about in your application? Right, how can I mention these things that I've written about in my application? How can I now bring those to life in the interview? So if they asked you about, for example, like you were just saying, how would you ensure that people love history outside of the classroom? Right, can you think of one of your examples that links to that, and how you've already done that, what the impact of that has already been, and how you would bring that into your current school? And so for me, I actually think, I was talking about in the previous episode about this STARE paragraph. I actually got given the piece of advice by my current head teacher, actually, because I went for this a role last year that I didn't get, which I don't think I should have gotten anyway, but I went for the interview experience. And afterwards, he gave me like a full half-an-hour feedback session, which was great. And in that, he said, right, your answers that you give at interview, he said STAR paragraphing, but he basically said you should be structuring it like that when you are giving the answer.
And for people that haven't listened to the previous episode, remind people what the STARE.
So the STARE one is STARE as in like stairs that you walk up. So it's situation, target, action, impact, reflection. And you said about the STAR,
which is action and then results. So the same S&T, but action and result, which doesn't give you the chance to reflect, which we were saying in that previous episode is a really nice additional bit, because actually, they want a reflective practitioner.
Yeah, and it totally made sense. When he said that, I was like, oh yeah, actually, I do in my application. Why on earth did I not do that when I was at interview? Maybe I naturally done it sometimes, but to consciously think about structuring my answer as a, you know, if they've asked me, you know, give me a time when you've dealt with a tutor that is not participating in the tutor program, and I'm like, oh, actually, right, situation, what was my target, what was my action, how did it impact, you know, the whole team, like blah blah blah, and then like you've got.
And also it makes me think that kind of helps with timing, because again, when I've been on the other end of it, so when I've been a head of department interviewing people, what I've noticed is some people give very short answers which are not detailed enough, and we might sometimes say, can you tell us more, but if they don't have that model, they might think, okay, I could keep talking, but where am I going with this? I've also had the other side where people just keep talking and you have to politely say, okay, we've got what we need there, thank you. But if they had that idea that I'm going to say, you know, almost 1 to 2 sentences on the situation,
and
I think
actually
really
you're not spending more than like 5 minutes on a question, which you're right, they usually have a time limit of, you know, 45 minutes, let's say, for an interview, or an hour or whatever it is. They don't really want to go past that time limit because they're interviewing more than just you.
Yeah, they don't have time to.
So, you know, I think I agree with you. So it's not just the having the examples, it's how you're talking about those examples in the actual interview, and to consciously think about a structure. You do it in your application.
Do it again.
Do it again, but in your interview.
And then I guess the other bit that we want to mention is that they will always say to you, do you have any questions for us?
Yes,
and
always.
I feel you should have questions for them, but what I would say as a disclaimer to that, it shouldn't be a question just for the sake of asking, or something that you could have found out if you looked at the website properly.
So I always ask them something personal, like not about them, that would be weird, but more like, what is your favourite thing about working in this school? So like something that I can't find out on the website. You know, what's your favourite kind of thing to teach or something like that, you know, because they're teachers as well usually. So it's going to be like maybe a little bit of a conversation starter, and kind of gives a little bit of an insight, because if they come out with something quite generic, then you're like, you're like, do you really like working here? You know, and obviously one of our things that we concentrate on a lot is well-being, like staff well-being and stuff like that. So I know a lot of people ask about staff well-being and how mental health is kind of taken care of in the school, or workload, and along those lines, which are always quite nice questions.
So I do something similar. I say, how are you a life-friendly school? So that was the topic we were talking about with Emma Shepherd from the MTPT project. And what that doesn't tell them I'm a mother and I'm thinking of this, although it shouldn't alarm them if I do. It gets them thinking about a teacher at any stage of their career might have various things going on in their life where they need to know that their own life is being looked after, their well-being is thought of. And so if that question throws them a little bit, that kind of sends alarm bells to me. If they can talk about their wellbeing coordinator and what they do, or how they reduce workload and pinch points, and how they've got lots of staff on part-time contracts, then that's telling me, okay, this is a school I could work at. Which then links to one of the other things I wanted to say about lots of people that go for part-time roles. Lots of people that want part-time roles, but most roles are advertised as full-time in teaching. Don't know when to ask about that. So I'll have done the pre-application visit to get an idea if it is a life-friendly school. I'll put the application in knowing that it is. I'm not going to put an application in that's not considering anything part-time or flexible. But I don't ask about flexible hours or anything in that interview, because I still think there's a lot of people that discriminate and will use it as a reason not to employ you. So I ask just how you're a life-friendly school, and then once I've got the job, I say, okay, so these are the things that I would want to take that job. So I want to know that I can do it as 0.8, I want to know this. And obviously I'm not just randomly asking a job that's full-time, can it suddenly be 1 day a week? I've had that pre-application visit, so I know what's kind of doable. Because I've probably spoken to the head of department, I know what hours they need to fill. So I think that's quite a good opportunity to get a broad sense of how they treat their staff. Then see if they offer you the job, then negotiate the flexible hours that you want.
And then, because you wanted to speak about the pay as well, negotiating pay.
Yeah.
Would you negotiate pay after you've been offered the job?
Yeah.
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 Okay.
So we talked about this just beforehand, didn't we? So every single job I've worked at, bar my very first one, because I was just given a job to teach first, I always negotiate my pay. So they offer me the job, and then in that phone call, I don't accept it until I've got a few grand higher than I want.
So how, just out of interest, what kind of thing do you say? How would you approach that? Because I am terrible with that. I literally never negotiate pay, which is definitely one of my downfalls.
So I think because it worked that time.
I find it really awkward, by the way.
It is quite awkward, but I guess, okay, so one thing is I've done it from kind of age 26 and I know that it always works. So then it feels less awkward. And also, I guess it's that recognition that however many people are at that interview, they're phoning you first. They've picked you.
Yeah.
So you do hold the power there.
Yeah.
And if they want you,
so when they say like, oh, we're offering you the role, you say, oh, actually, I want to negotiate pay, or what do you say?
Yes, and so I'll say, okay, so tell me what you're offering me, and I'll say, okay, I'd be needing a few more thousand to consider saying yes to that.
Okay.
I'd need to know that actually I can do this 0.8. I'd need to know that I can have this morning off. And sometimes I've gone for a role where it was a temporary role, and I said, oh, I need it to be made permanent now, and they said, okay, we'll make it permanent for you.
Okay.
But yeah, I always just have in my head, like, I don't think I'm being ridiculous. Like, I wouldn't say I want 10 grand higher.
Yeah.
But I just kind of think, every role, there's always kind of flexibility with pay, isn't there? Depending on how long the person they employ has been teaching, that affects their pay. If it's a TLR, we always know there's a range there.
Yeah.
So I always kind of think within that, just go for the top.
Yeah.
So whatever they're offering me, it's normally I ask for a few grand more.
Okay.
And they always say yes.
We have to do a whole podcast episode about negotiations after interview. Like, what do you actually? How do you negotiate?
Yeah.
And what do you negotiate, and what to actually say? Because it's almost nice to have a little bit of a script, so that you're not just off the cuff, kind of trying to say to them, "Nah, I'm not accepting this. You give me more money," because then they might get their back up and be like, "Oh, actually, no, we don't want to offer you the job anymore."
So that I won't get out of bed. That clearly was champagne driven when I was in my mid-20s. As a normal rule, I'm saying, "Oh, thank you so much. I do obviously need to think about this, look at my finances. I'd be looking at a few more grand to definitely say yes."
Yeah.
So I just kind of couch it that way.
Throw it out there and then see what they come back with.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
And sometimes they very quickly, I keep it quite vague, they quite quickly say, "Oh yeah, we can give you a few more." So then I'm like, "Oh, okay, so maybe I can go for quite a few more grand."
Because obviously you're seeing what they're...
And I think when you look at the research on it, and again, I can include this in the show notes, but it's the whole kind of discrepancy between men and women. Like, as a rule, men tend to always negotiate their salary no matter the profession.
I definitely think it's a woman thing for me.
And also other sectors. So I was speaking to a friend recently who says, this blew my mind. So she works in advertising, and she said that when she goes to apply for another job, she pretends that her current salary is 30 grand more than her actual salary.
Oh my God.
And then whatever they offer her, she'll ask for about 20 or 30 grand more than that. So she could be getting a jump from one job to another that might just be a sideways move of a 60 grand pay increase. And
but that's the private sector for you.
That blew, well, I'm in the private sector, aren't I? But it blew my mind. I was like, I'm trying to get an extra 3 grand and I'm feeling a bit guilty about it. And she's getting an extra 60 grand. So I was like, I shouldn't feel guilty about this.
No, you shouldn't. You absolutely shouldn't. But as a woman, and usually women have imposter syndrome, you just don't ask. And I literally don't ask. It's almost like a thing of, okay, they've offered me it, right, I'm just going to take it.
But I think that's back to what we said about the two-way process, that you have to decide that you want them. That's why you kind of ask them questions in the interview, but also they've decided they want you, you kind of hold the cards here, so this is your chance to negotiate. Because the other thing I'd say is, if you don't negotiate then, it's very hard to try and negotiate later. It's too late. You need to do it then. That's your chance to do it.
Okay, so get in the bin, go for the win, Jenny.
My get in the bin, go for the win, and I've had this a few times, is when you are at the interview stage and they don't let you meet current members of staff.
Oh, have you had it where they literally don't put you in the staff room or something like that.
Yeah.
Oh,
I've had times
that's a big red
where
flag.
it's a big red flag.
That is a big red flag.
Where you don't meet anyone in your department, you don't meet any other members of staff, you don't get to have a break or a lunchtime with them. And the thing is, I think sometimes at the time, depending how early on in your career you are, and how stressed and flustered you're probably feeling about the interview process, you might not even register that that's not happened. Because I've had times where I've had that, I've taken a job, and then I start the job, and I'm like, God, this is a pretty messed up department. And then I'm like, oh, I never met them.
Oh, because I never met them before,
I never met them.
Yeah.
But all you're thinking is, okay, that interview went well, you know, I had a tour from the student, it seemed like a nice school. But actually, I didn't sit down and talk to members of staff.
Yeah, no, that is a big red flag for me, I think. Like, at least put you in the staff room so that you can kind of, like, speak to people, even when you're kind of in between things. Because, like I said, for a state school, it's, like, lots of different tasks or whatever. So you'll have, like, little breaks in between. Like, where are you in that time? Are you with other members of staff?
I've had times where they put you in a room on your own. And I guess they're thinking, oh, maybe you're nervous and you want some time to yourself. And that's kind of okay. But then build into part of the day, have break with current members of staff.
Yeah,
or
definitely.
Meet your department. I think you really need to meet your department.
Yeah.
So my go for the win is make sure that, you know, the HR people, whoever is scheduling these interviews, they build in. And I think the best is when you have a full lunch.
Yeah.
And I know I'm saying this working at private schools, and you get to, I only say yes to a job, I forgot to say this, because I always ask what free food you offer the staff, and I always want to experience the food. Forgot to add that bit in. But yeah, I want to have a full lunch there and check that I'm happy eating this lunch for however many years of my life. I want to know it's a good lunch. I want to know there are good members of staff that I can have a good natter with on my lunch hour. And I want to actually have a kind of relaxed conversation with people in my department to see if I want to work with them for the next however many years of my life.
I think that's a very fair thing to ask for. And me going for pastoral roles, for example, you know, you're never going to meet like all your tutors or something like that, but at least meeting some other people that are part of the pastoral team, maybe like other heads of years. I think that's really important because they will be honest with you. And they will be the ones that really give you the idea of whether you are the right person to work in that school and whether you actually want to work there or not. Because, like you said to start off with, it is also your decision as well, not just their decision. And that's just something to always keep in mind when you're at an interview. I mean, you can walk out midway through an interview, like
which I've done.
Yeah, you can not walk out literally, but like you can say to them, I don't want to carry on with this process. For whatever reason, lots of different reasons. I don't know why you...
So I walked out of a particular, and I was one of 6 people that walked out of a possible 7. So 6 of us walked out in this one day. And the bit that made me walk out is that they wanted me, this was going for a head of department job, they wanted me to grade a lesson. The lesson was a DT teacher covering a history lesson by showing a George Clooney movie. And I was there with the deputy head and I said, they're just watching a George Clooney movie. And she was like, yeah, you're still going to need to give it a grade. I'm like, well, obviously it's a complete fail.
Like,
and why are we doing this? And I said, actually, I think I should just leave right now.
Yeah.
And then so she escorted me out of the building and I left.
Yeah, and that's fair enough because you knew at that point you don't want to work for a school that does that.
No.
So yeah, I think
everything
that's
about it.
fair.
I was like, what does that say about the leadership? That they think this is an okay activity.
Yeah.
And that no one stopped to say it's not okay just to be watching this film as a cover lesson for year 11s when they were February of year 11. And everything about it, I just thought the task made no sense considering the circumstances.
So it's like they're interviewing you, but really you should also be interviewing them. And I think that's a really good place to end off because actually that is really the best piece of advice. Don't just think it's an interview for you. You have to also think of it as an interview for them as well.
And you could get a job. They might want you, but you might not want them. So it's okay to say no to it.
Yeah, it is okay. But I think in these times of like hard times, like people are more likely to just accept something, but you just need to know your worth as well.
Yeah, I know that there are other roles out there, but yeah, I know what you're saying. Yeah.
Anyway,
on that note,
thank you for listening,
Thanks for listening.
and hopefully you join us next week where we are talking about
the big O.
The Big O.
Which means Ofsted.
The Big O, or Ofsted, or
ISI.
inspections.
ISI.
Yeah, so like.
So yeah, inspections. How to get through
Inspections.
inspections
And remain happy.
Yes.
All right, see you soon. Bye.
Bye.